thousands of the world's most feared. Elite Mongol horsemen poured over the fortress walls, screaming in absolute triumph as they thought they had finally breached the city. But instead of an easy victory, they had just charged blindly into a suffocating 3-meter-wide meat grinder, trapped in a claustrophobic stone labyrinth. These legendary warriors looked up only to realize that a handful of desperate, armed civilians were waiting on the rooftops above, ready to rain down an inescapable storm of heavy boulders, wooden beams, and boiling liquid fire. But to understand how history reached this terrifying breaking point, and how an unstoppable empire was humiliated by farmers and grandmothers, we have to go back to the beginning. It was 5 a.m. on the 15th of August, in the year 1231, when the very first columns of dust appeared on the horizon. From the high stone walls of the Kuju Fortress, the sentries watched in absolute horror as that dust turned into a dark, churning tide. Covering the plains as far as the eye could see, 20,000 elite Mongol riders were advancing toward them. General Park Seo climbed the main tower and counted his forces. He had exactly 300 trained soldiers, the rest a terrified collection of armed peasants, clutching whatever farm tools they could find, alongside thousands of frightened refugees huddling inside the walls. That was all he had to defend his home against the most devastating, unstoppable military machine the earth had ever witnessed. This is the true story of what happened when the impossible faced the inevitable. At this point in time, the Mongols knew no defeat. Under the rule of Genghis Khan, they had conquered more territory in just 25 years than the Roman Empire had taken in 400. China had fallen after decades of resistance. Persia, with its millennial fortified cities, had been swept entirely off the map. Legendary capitals that once inspired awe were now nothing more than ashes and fading memories. Their strategy was brutal, efficient, and horrifyingly simple. They arrived, demanded immediate surrender, and if the answer was no, they erased everything. There was no negotiation. There was no mercy. You only had 2 options: submit or perish. The Mongol commander of the forces in Korea, General Sartak, held a completely flawless record. He had just seized 15 fortresses in the last 3 months alone, and not a single one had managed to resist for more than 48 hours. Kuju was supposed to be fortress number 16. Everyone knew it. Even the defenders standing on the walls knew it. So, when Sartak sent his envoy demanding the immediate surrender of the city, he expected the usual terrified submission, but General Park gave a response that completely stunned the invader. He looked the envoy in the eye and sent back a chilling message. "Tell your general to come and take what he can. We will not abandon these walls alive." It was a total death sentence, absolute military madness. 300 men against 20,000 of the most feared conquerors on the planet. The odds weren't just bad. They were totally non-existent. But what the Mongols could not possibly know in that moment was that General Park was no ordinary commander. He had a plan. He had engineered traps the Mongol Empire had never faced, and most importantly, he commanded men and women who had decided that falling on their feet was far better than living on their knees. To truly grasp the nightmare rolling toward Kuju, you have to understand the sheer, overwhelming scale of the Mongol war machine in 1231. This was not an ordinary army. It was a dark, consuming force of nature. Genghis Khan had passed away 4 years prior, but his son, Ogedei, was utterly obsessed with expanding the largest empire the world had ever seen. In just 2.5 decades, they had swallowed territories spanning from the Black Sea all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Their most devastating weapon was not the recurve bow, and it was not their lightning-fast cavalry. It was absolute psychological terror. Their envoys carried a remarkably simple ultimatum to the gates of every city: open your doors and live as subjects, or resist and be completely erased. And it was never a bluff. Legendary Persian cities packed with hundreds of thousands of souls simply ceased to exist after making the fatal mistake of choosing to fight. The Mongols made brutal examples out of resistance to ensure the next city would drop to its knees without a single arrow taking flight. By 1231, the crosshairs of this flawless destruction machine locked onto the Korean peninsula. The political climate was already in total collapse. The kingdom of Goryeo was crumbling from the inside out. In an act of ultimate betrayal to his people, the king himself had fled to an island stronghold, completely abandoning the mainland and leaving his citizens to fend for themselves. City after city fell. The nobles bowed their heads one after another. Resistance seemed utterly pointless. Enter General Sartak. He was not just any field commander. He was a hardened, elite veteran of the massive Chinese campaigns, a man who had cracked towering fortresses that were widely considered to be totally impregnable. Sartak was ruthlessly efficient. He despised wasting time on prolonged engagements. If a city did not break in the first few days, he simply cut off their supplies, starved them out, and left no one breathing inside as a grim lesson to the rest of the kingdom. He arrived in Korea with 20,000 of the empire's absolute best horsemen, and within 3 short months, 15 fortresses, walls had fallen. The longest any of them had managed to hold out was just 36 hours. Sartak was riding a wave of terrifying momentum, and his arrogance was at an all-time high. His next target was Kuju. It was not massive. It did not control a major strategic choke point. It was supposed to be a tiny, insignificant speed bump on Sartak's flawless record. Fortress number 16. But Kuju had General Park Seo. Park was 45 years old. A man who did not come from a wealthy noble family or boast political connections. He had clawed his way up the military ranks, fighting bandits and pirates in forgotten border skirmishes. But what made Park truly dangerous was his mind. While other commanders relied on the exact same tired, traditional tactics that the Mongols had already mastered defeating, Park was an obsessive scholar of war. He spent his nights analyzing ancient military texts, designing bizarre siege weapons, and experimenting with untested defensive formations. His own superiors thought he was eccentric, too theoretical, completely impractical. When the invasion began, his orders were not to achieve a victory. His orders were simply to delay the inevitable, hold the invaders off for a day or two, so more important cities could evacuate. Any rational commander would have looked at Kuju's defenses and immediately waved the white flag. The aging stone walls were only 8 meters high. He had barely 300 trained men who had never seen a real siege, armed with basic bows, crossbows, and spears. Inside, 2,000 terrified civilian refugees consumed his incredibly limited 3-week food supply. Outside the gates, Sartak was unrolling a horrifying arsenal heavy battering rams, towering mobile siege machines, and catapults that had shattered fortresses 10 times the size of Kuju. The math was brutally simple. Surrender was the only logical way to avoid total destruction. But General Park gathered his officers the night before the dark tide arrived. He looked at the trembling men and delivered a cold, calculated truth. He told them, "Tomorrow, we will see if 20,000 men who believe they have already won can defeat 300 who know they have absolutely nothing to lose." It was not empty bravado. It was a piercing psychological insight. Park understood the one fatal flaw of the invincible Mongol strategy. They relied entirely on speed and terror. But what happens to a perfect war machine built on terror? When the prey simply refuses to be terrified. On August 16th, the dawn broke to the terrifying sight of 20,000 elite horsemen forming a perfect, suffocating ring around Kuju. Sartak's first weapon was psychological. For an entire day, his riders simply circled the walls, beating their weapons, screaming, and choking the sky with a massive cloud of dust inside the fortress. The sheer panic was deafening. Civilians wept, and young soldiers trembled, but General Park stepped into the central courtyard and silenced the masses with cold reality. "We will not leave here alive, so we will make every hour they spend trying to take us cost them dearly." Sartak, realizing that his generous offers of surrender were falling on deaf ears, unleashed his captured Chinese siege engineers, massive battering rams, mobile towers, and heavy catapults began to rise from the earth. But Park had spent the previous weeks turning Kuju into an absolute house of horrors. He dug hidden trenches just behind the main walls to create deadly secondary obstacles. He built elevated firing platforms. But his most revolutionary tactic was his workforce. He didn't just rely on his 300 soldiers. He organized the 2,000 terrified civilians into a relentless, hyper-efficient production machine. Women rapidly forged arrowheads and sewed projectile bags. The elderly meticulously rationed the dwindling food and water. Children sprinted through the chaotic fortress as battlefield messengers. Everyone had a singular purpose. No one had the time to sit and panic. He also implemented a genius rotation. Only 1/3 of his men manned the walls at any given time. The rest slept and recovered. This ensured his defenders would always be fresher than the enemy. And for the walls themselves, he had carved deep, vertical channels directly into the exterior stone, leading straight down to the ground. Then, he hoarded every single drop of oil, tar, and flammable liquid in the province. On the 4th day, the horrifying rhythm of the Mongol war drums echoed through a thick morning fog. Boom, boom, boom. Then, the sky darkened. Massive boulders launched from catapults crashed through the fortress roofs, eliminating 15 civilians instantly. The softening phase had begun. The next morning, the fog lifted, revealing 3,000 dismounted Mongol elites advancing in a terrifying, shielded formation. Battering rams rolled toward the ancient wooden gates. Siege towers crept toward the walls. The ultimate clash was mere seconds away. If you were General Park, standing on that wall with only 300 men against 3,000 elite shock troops, what would you do? Do you fire your arrows immediately to keep them at a distance? Or do you hold your ground and let them reach the walls to spring your traps? Pause the video right now. Comment your decision below. I want to know what you would do. With your decision made, the trap was finally sprung. General Park stood like a statue. He watched them march closer. 100 meters, 80 meters. The Mongol archers unleashed a black cloud of arrows, striking down 7 Korean defenders. 50 meters, Park raised his hand. He waited until the invaders were at 30 meters, right in the optimal strike zone. Then he dropped his hand. 100 Korean bows snapped simultaneously. But they didn't just fire blindly. Park had trained them to target specific tactical zones. The first 2 rows of the Mongol vanguard collapsed instantly. Before the invaders could even process the strike, a second devastating volley hit them, then a third. Park's rotating firing squads unleashed an endless, brutal stream of armor-piercing projectiles. But the Mongols never retreated. They surged forward through the storm, planting their heavy wooden ladders against Kuju's ancient stone. At the main gate, a colossal battering ram began pounding the wood into splinters. The invaders scrambled up the ladders like a swarm of angry hornets. This was the exact moment Park activated his masterpiece. He ordered his men to unleash the cauldrons. Scalding, boiling oil poured not just over the edge, but directly into the custom-carved channels Park had prepared. The oil accelerated, fanning out and turning the entire face of the fortress into a cascading waterfall of glowing, liquid fire. The invaders caught on the ladders were instantly engulfed. Screams echoed across the valley as elite warriors were fused to the wood, dragging their comrades down with them into the burning inferno below. Down at the main gate, after 2 agonizing hours of pounding, the massive wooden doors finally shattered. The Mongols roared in triumph and poured through the breach, only to smash face first into a solid wall of iron and stone. Park had secretly built a reinforced secondary gate right behind the first one. The battering ram had achieved absolutely nothing. Furious, the Mongols pushed their towering siege machines directly against the walls, finally securing a foothold to fire downward. But Park unleashed his mobile reserve. 60 fresh, rested defenders charged the parapets with oversized spears. They didn't try to break the heavy towers. With a coordinated, desperate heave, they pushed the unstable wooden giants backward. The colossal structures tipped, groaned, and violently crashed to the earth, crushing the elite archers inside beneath tons of splintered timber. After 4 hours of absolute devastation, Sartaq sounded the retreat. The Mongols left over 200 of their finest warriors in the dirt. General Park had lost 23 men. The impossible had happened. The invincible Mongol war machine had failed their very first assault. But Sartaq was not a man who accepted humiliation quietly. The nightmare was only just beginning. For Sartaq, the humiliation of that failed first assault was absolute poison to his ego. He abandoned all patience, realizing his flawless reputation was hanging by a thread. He subjected the exhausted defenders to relentless, rotating assaults. never giving them a single moment to close their eyes. By the 25th day, General Park's forces had been utterly decimated. He had barely 160 exhausted, injured men still standing. The food was gone. The water was running out, knowing the end was near. Sartak ordered a final, overwhelming human tsunami. 15,000 elite Mongol warriors charged Kuju simultaneously from every possible direction. Faced with impossible odds, General Park made the most insane tactical decision of his entire life. He ordered his men to abandon the walls. He concentrated the last of his hardened soldiers at the main gate and left 70% of the fortress fortifications completely undefended. The Mongols scaled the eastern and southern walls with zero resistance. They poured over the stone parapets, roaring in absolute triumph, convinced the city had finally broken. But they had just walked into the ultimate nightmare. As the invaders dropped down from the outer walls, they didn't find the open courtyard they expected. Instead, Park had secretly constructed a labyrinth of towering inner secondary walls. The massive Mongol swarm was instantly choked into a series of suffocating 3-meter-wide stone alleys. Thousands of elite horsemen were packed so tightly together they couldn't even raise their shields or swing their blades. Then they looked up. Lining the adjacent rooftops were the very civilians the Mongols had planned to erase. Women, the elderly, and desperate refugees unleashed total devastation. Heavy wooden beams, massive stones, and the final reserves of scalding oil rained directly down into the claustrophobic corridors. The invaders were trapped in a helpless, chaotic crush. Panic ripped through the Mongol ranks as warriors trampled each other, trying to escape the enclosed kill zones. For every Korean defender who fell, 5 invaders were silenced. The Mongols literally had to climb over towering mountains of their own fallen comrades just to move a single inch. Even at the main gate, when the reinforced doors finally splintered, the charging Mongols were funneled into a narrow corridor of doom. Elevated platforms lined the walls, and Korean archers rained armor-piercing projectiles down from impossible angles, systematically dismantling the front line. After 14 agonizing hours of non-stop, brutal close-quarters combat, Sartak finally called the retreat. The turning point had arrived. The invincible war machine had been completely broken by farmers and an eccentric general. In the ruthless aftermath, Sartak's desperation turned dark. Unable to take the fortress by force, he resorted to throwing the remains of fallen animals into the city's water supply to slowly erase the defenders from the inside out. But then, an envoy arrived. The Korean king, hiding safely on his island retreat, had officially surrendered to the Mongol Empire. The war was over. Yet Sartak, blinded by his shattered pride, refused to lift the siege. He demanded just 2 more days to bring Kuju to ashes. Inside the walls, completely unaware of the peace treaty, General Park gathered his final 73 surviving soldiers. They braced for the ultimate end, vowing to perish on their feet. But as the thick fog lifted on the 33rd day, the defenders witnessed the impossible. The terrifying Mongol camp was being dismantled. Sartak's own officers had forced him to obey the Great Khan's orders without a single word. The most feared army on earth simply turned their backs and marched away in utter disgrace. The legacy of Kuju sent shockwaves across the globe. When the staggering casualty reports finally reached Genghis Khan, the silence in his towering court was deafening. 300 men had humiliated his unstoppable empire. Sartak was quietly stripped of his command, his legendary record permanently stained, and he was sent to fade away and forgotten. Minor campaigns, General Park became an instant living legend, though his jealous, cowardly king quickly forced him into quiet retirement, terrified of a general who commanded more respect than the crown itself. But the political and military landscape was forever altered. The Mongols were forced to swallow their pride and study Park's brilliant defensive innovations, completely changing how they conducted siege warfare in their future conquests of China and Japan. And for the people of Korea, Kuju proved that the terrifying Mongol invaders were not immortal gods. They were just men, and against the unbreakable will of a desperate few, even the perfect war machine could be brought to a grinding halt. In the end, the siege of Kuju was not just a military standoff. It was the absolute shattering of a terrifying myth. The Mongol Empire had built its entire foundation on the psychological illusion of absolute invincibility. They were the ultimate conquerors, accustomed to rapid, overwhelming victories and enemies who dropped to their knees before a single bowstring was even drawn. But General Park and his handful of defenders proved that even the most devastating war machine in human history could be brought to its knees. They demonstrated that sheer, overwhelming numbers are ultimately useless against a brilliant tactical mind and a desperate people who have already accepted their fate. If this story of impossible survival and absolute defiance changed your perspective on history, hit that like button. And if you want to uncover more of the dark secrets, brilliant tactics, and forgotten stands of the past, make sure you subscribe and turn on the notification bell right now so you never miss an episode. Because as the dust finally settled over the shattered gates of Kuju, 73 starving defenders taught the world a chilling truth sometimes. The greatest victory is not about conquering an empire, but simply refusing to be broken by one.